The storm hit early in 1893, catching the ranchers of the High Plains off guard. But Charlie Reynolds, the man everyone called a fool, had already built a cabin that would endure the worst of it. Before we ride further, tell us where you're listening from, and if Frontier Tales speak to you, hitch your horse at the channel and stay for tomorrow's story. By the time the first snowflakes drifted down in late November of 1893, the wind had already begun its slow siege across the plains. The cold came early that year, biting and relentless. It wouldn't let go. Many ranchers had prepared their cabins with all the usual measures: thick logs, tightly fitted, and windows sealed tight against the coming storms. But not Charlie Reynolds. Charlie had arrived in the High Plains a decade earlier, at the age of 32, a man of sturdy build and quiet determination. He was the sort who believed in doing things his own way, despite what others might say. His neighbors had long called him the fool behind his back, or sometimes to his face, when they saw the strange way he worked on his cabin. Instead of rushing to finish as the first winter approached, Charlie had taken his time, laying each log with care and precision, ensuring the structure was sound. But there was one thing that made his cabin look different from the others: a peculiar gap between the logs at the top of the wall, near the roofline. It was a small thing, hardly noticeable unless you knew to look, but it caused no end of gossip. Some said he hadn't finished the job, that he'd simply neglected to chink the space between the logs. Others assumed he was too lazy to do it right. Yet Charlie said little about it, shrugging off the comments, his focus on a more immediate task. There was a quiet confidence in the way he moved, in the way he stacked the wood in his cabin and prepared the fireplace. He had other plans for that gap, plans no one could have anticipated. Winter hit hard in the first days of December. Snow piled up on the roof, weighing heavy on the wooden beams, but Charlie was ready. The fire he built each night was a spectacle, crackling and popping in the stone fireplace he'd constructed by hand. His cabin was warm, warmer than any of his neighbors' cabins, even those that had been sealed up tightly. The gap, they said, was a mistake. But as Charlie sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, he knew it wasn't. The small opening at the top of the cabin allowed the smoke to rise and flow freely through the roof. It also let the warm air circulate more evenly through the cabin, filling every corner, even those that should have been the coldest. And when the wind howled outside, the gap let in just enough fresh air to keep the cabin from becoming too stuffy, too stagnant. It was a design that worked with the elements, not against them. Charlie had learned long ago that survival was about balance, not just in the way you built things, but in the way you lived. And as the days grew colder and the snow piled higher, his foolish wall gap became his most trusted ally. The fire burned steady, the warmth spreading throughout the cabin, as Charlie leaned back in his chair and took in the silence of a storm-ravaged world beyond the walls. The other ranchers didn't understand it. But soon, as the weeks passed and the snow showed no signs of stopping, they'd have to come to terms with the fact that Charlie's cabin was one that stood firm against the cold. The first full week of December saw no let-up in the storm. The snow piled up against Charlie's cabin, draping the landscape in a blanket of white. The wind howled from the northwest, sweeping across the high plains with a fury that turned the cold into something raw, something alive. But inside his cabin, the fire burned steady, its glow reflecting off the rough-hewn logs of the walls. Charlie sat in a sturdy wooden chair by the hearth, his thick coat draped over the back, a mug of hot coffee warming his hands. The wind howled, but it did not touch him. Outside, the ranchers who had built their homes with speed and economy were feeling the brunt of the storm. Their cabins, hastily constructed, had not held up well against the brutal winds. Jack Carter's cabin, just a few miles to the south, had already shown signs of weakness. The wind had found the cracks in his notched logs, seeping through like water finding a hole in a dam. Jack was huddled inside with his wife, both of them trying to stoke a fire that refused to take. The firewood they'd gathered was damp from the heavy snow and the moisture in the air, making it hard to keep the flames going. At the other end of the valley, Tom Burke had spent most of his morning shoveling snow off the roof of his cabin, but it didn't seem to help. The weight of the snow, combined with the wind pressure, had begun to buckle his roof. His wife and children were trying to keep warm, but the cabin was drafty. The chimney was clogged with soot from an old fire that had been left burning too long. Tom's face was pinched with the stress of the storm, his movements hurried and panicked. Meanwhile, at Charlie's cabin, the fire continued to crackle, its warmth filling the room. The gap between the logs at the top of the wall, which had been the subject of so much mockery, was working its subtle magic. It allowed the hot air to circulate freely, rising through the chimney without causing a backdraft that would make the cabin too stuffy. The smoke, too, rose with ease, escaping without issue. In the back corner of the cabin, a large stack of firewood was waiting for the next cold snap. Charlie had anticipated this, he always did. It wasn't that Charlie was more prepared than the others. It was that he had thought about the future, about the worst possible conditions. While his neighbors had rushed to build quickly, wanting to prove their worth and claim their land, Charlie had built slowly. Each log was placed with care. Every space, every gap, every crack was considered and planned for. He had known that the winds would come. He had known that the snow would pile up. And he had known that when the world outside became a freezing wasteland, his cabin would be the one to survive. As the night stretched on and the temperature dropped further, Charlie felt no fear. He had weathered storms like this before. In the quiet, with only the fire and the wind for company, he thought back to his first winter in the high plains, how his cabin had been his only refuge then, too. His mind wandered back to simpler times, times when he had first learned the importance of building for the worst. It had taken him years to understand the true meaning of survival on the frontier. He'd learned it from the land itself, from the silent teachings of the trees and the stones and the endless horizon stretching out before him. Charlie leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire seep into his bones. The storm outside raged on, but inside his cabin, he was safe. And for tonight, that was all that mattered. By mid-December, the storm showed no signs of stopping. It was the sort of winter the ranchers had heard about in old tales, the kind that turned every corner of the high plains into a frozen wasteland. The temperature had plunged below zero, and the winds only made it worse. For 3 days, the storm raged, and every rancher within a 20-mile radius of Charlie's cabin had their hands full just trying to stay alive. Jack Carter, who had mocked Charlie's cabin for its foolish design, was the first to make his way over. He had no choice. His own cabin, barely more than a lean-to, was already showing signs of collapse. The door had blown open in the night, and snow had piled up against the walls. The small fire he managed to keep burning barely offered warmth, and his wife, Margaret, was coughing, a clear sign of the chill creeping into her lungs. By the time Jack reached Charlie's cabin, his face was wind-burned, his eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. He didn't knock. Instead, he opened the door and stepped inside, shaking the snow off his coat. The warm air from the fire immediately hit him, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting it wash over him like a blessing. Charlie looked up from his chair, offering a quiet nod. "Had to come, didn't you?" Jack said nothing at first, just took off his gloves and dropped them by the fire. "I didn't think it'd be this bad," he muttered, finally meeting Charlie's gaze. Charlie didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, the crackling of the fire filling the room. Jack, still shivering despite the warmth, was too proud to ask for help, but Charlie knew what he needed. He stood up slowly, walking over to the large stack of firewood in the corner, and began to cut a fresh log for the fire. "You got a spot by the hearth," Charlie said, his voice low but steady. "Stay as long as you need." Jack hesitated, then sank to the floor, his back pressed against the wall. "I never thought your gap would be the answer," he admitted quietly. "I thought you were wasting time. But now, hell, now I see." Charlie didn't reply, but his hands paused briefly, the log split in two by his axe. The gap, the foolish gap, was now doing what Charlie had always known it would, circulating warm air, drawing fresh air in, without suffocating the fire, letting the cabin breathe. The warmth was even, steady, like the calm before a storm. Jack could already feel the difference, the cold leaving his bones, replaced by a comforting heat. As the night wore on and the storm continued to batter the land, Charlie's cabin became more than a shelter, it became a symbol of survival. The gap wasn't just a mistake anymore, it was proof of Charlie's foresight. The gap had saved them. It was the quiet victory of careful thought over rushed assumptions. The wind howled outside, but inside Charlie's cabin there was peace. By late January, the storm had subsided, but the cold remained. The plains were still locked in the grip of winter, and the ranchers were beginning to realize the truth: what they had built could not withstand the full force of a hard winter. Their cabins, hastily thrown together with single walls and shallow thought, were failing them. Charlie's cabin, on the other hand, stood as a quiet testament to survival. The fire kept burning, the warmth continued to spread, and the gap in the wall, now fully understood, became a thing of legend. Charlie didn't boast, but the story of his cabin spread quickly. The ranchers who had scoffed at him for his odd ways and his slow construction came to him for advice. Jack Carter, his closest neighbor, spoke openly about Charlie's methods, sharing what he had learned during his time in the warmth of the cabin. "The man's a genius," Jack would say, "and that foolish gap is what's saving us all." Some of the ranchers still couldn't bring themselves to fully embrace it. They had built their cabins the way they had been taught, quickly and with the cheapest materials they could find. To admit they had been wrong felt like defeat. But the truth was undeniable. Those who had spent their winters huddled around cold hearths and drafty rooms were beginning to see the wisdom in Charlie's approach. They came to him, seeking advice, asking how they could improve their own cabins. One such rancher, Tom Burke, arrived at Charlie's cabin one early afternoon, his face weary and drawn from weeks of battling the cold. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong," Tom confessed, looking at Charlie as if he were the last hope. "My fire doesn't stay lit for more than a few hours. I can't seem to get enough heat, and my wife and kids are suffering." Charlie studied him carefully, the steady warmth of his cabin a stark contrast to the bitter cold just outside. He knew the problem without needing to ask. Tom's cabin was built just like the others, the logs hastily stacked, the windows poorly sealed, the roof too thin. But Charlie didn't say a word about what Tom had done wrong. Instead, he simply nodded toward the fire and spoke with quiet authority. "You've got the wrong kind of wood," Charlie said. "And your chimney's probably clogged. But it's more than that. Your walls aren't thick enough. You've got the wrong materials in place." Tom shifted uncomfortably, his pride stinging. "I built it the way I was told." Charlie didn't comment on the fast construction methods that had been so popular. Instead, he turned to the stack of firewood in the corner and began splitting it methodically. "You need to build for the worst. The cold's unforgiving. It tests every part of you, every part of what you built, but it doesn't care if you're ready." Tom watched him, the firelight casting a warm glow across his face. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope. Charlie's simple words held a wisdom he hadn't fully appreciated before. It wasn't about speed, it was about survival, and Charlie Reynolds had learned that lesson long before the rest of them. The days grew shorter as February came and the storm returned. This time, it was fiercer than ever. The wind howled louder, whipping the snow across the plains in blinding waves. Charlie's cabin, though, remained warm, a beacon in the endless white. He had prepared well, and the fire continued to burn steady, the gap in the wall doing its silent work, allowing the heat to spread and the air to circulate. But this time, it wasn't just his own survival at stake. The others were starting to buckle under the weight of the winter. Their cabins, barely able to withstand the first storms, were now failing them completely. The wind, relentless and biting, found its way through the gaps and cracks, and the chill seeped in where it shouldn't have. The nights grew unbearable for those who had rushed to build their homes, their fires often choking out or simply too weak to combat the growing cold. Then came the night that would change everything. Charlie had just finished a long day of cutting firewood and was sitting by the fire, his gaze fixed on the steady flames. The wind was particularly vicious, the sound of it pressing against the walls like a living thing. The warmth in the cabin was a comfort, but it was also a reminder of just how harsh the world had become outside. The knock on the door came unexpectedly, sharp against the crackling of the fire. Charlie rose, stretching his stiff legs, and walked over to open it. There, standing in the snow, was Tom Burke. His face was pale, his eyes wide with desperation. "Charlie, I need help," Tom said, his voice rough with cold and fatigue. Charlie stepped aside without a word, letting Tom in. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps as he shook the snow from his coat and gloves. He didn't need to say anything more. Charlie could see the panic in his eyes. "Margaret's ill," Tom continued, his words tumbling out as he sat near the fire, rubbing his frozen hands together. "The kids, they're cold, Charlie. I don't know how much longer we can last." Charlie didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and nodded toward the door. "Let's go." They made their way to Tom's cabin, Charlie's mind already racing with what needed to be done. Tom had been too focused on the immediate needs of his family to notice the small things. The firewood was damp, the chimney clogged, and the gap, well, there was no gap. The cold air had nowhere to escape, and the warmth couldn't circulate. It was all too familiar to Charlie, a mistake he had learned from years ago. Inside Tom's cabin, Margaret lay shivering on a cot, her breath shallow. The children were curled up together, near the fire. But it wasn't enough to keep them warm. Charlie immediately set to work, instructing Tom to gather more firewood while he cleared the chimney. The fire in the hearth sputtered, weak against the cold air that rushed in. Charlie knew that he had only a few hours to make a difference. By the time the first light of dawn cracked through the snowstorm, Charlie had worked through the night. The cabin had been transformed. The chimney cleared, fresh firewood stacked, and the gap between the logs, now more than just a hole, had been altered to allow for better airflow. The warmth inside Tom's cabin was immediate and palpable, filling the air with life again. The fire blazed steadily, the heat circulating in a way that it never had before. Charlie sat near the hearth, his hands warm from the heat, watching as Tom moved about, his face no longer tight with worry. He took in the sight of his wife, now wrapped in blankets, her color returning to her cheeks, and his children, their faces no longer pinched with cold. The storm still raged outside, but inside this small cabin there was peace. "You saved us," Tom said quietly, his voice filled with both gratitude and disbelief. He had been too proud to ask for help before, but now, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, he understood something he had missed before Charlie had been right all along. The gap wasn't a mistake. It was the key. It wasn't just about keeping the fire burning. It was about ensuring the space could breathe, that warmth could reach every corner, even the coldest places. Charlie didn't respond right away. He merely watched the fire, the dancing flames reflecting in his eyes. The work wasn't done, not yet. But for the first time in a long while, Charlie felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not for the work he had done, but for the lives he had saved. The gap, the one everyone had mocked, had become the difference between life and death. As the day passed, more ranchers found their way to Tom's cabin. Word had spread quickly that Charlie had somehow managed to save Tom's family, and soon enough, others came seeking refuge. They trickled in slowly at first, each man or woman bringing with them stories of their own struggles against the unrelenting winter. As they crossed the threshold of Tom's cabin, they were greeted by the same warmth, the same comfort that Charlie had made possible. One by one, they settled into the corners of the cabin, their faces tired but hopeful. The storm had them all trapped for the time being, but at least, inside these walls, they could breathe. The fire burned steady, the gap allowing the warmth to reach every person, every corner, every shadow. It wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Charlie didn't mind the crowd. In fact, he welcomed it. The cabin had room enough for everyone, and he had more than enough firewood to keep the warmth flowing. As he settled back into his chair by the hearth, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. The storm outside had raged with all its fury, but inside this small cabin there was refuge. The winter's grip slowly loosened as February bled into March. The relentless storm, which had seemed eternal, finally began to break. the winds dying down and the snow letting up. What remained was the aftermath, a landscape buried under a thick blanket of white, the once familiar terrain, now an unfamiliar stretch of frozen land. The ranchers, many of them still holed up in Charlie's cabin, watched the storm's retreat with both relief and dread. Relief because the worst of the winter was over. Dread because they knew the cost would be tallied soon enough. Charlie rose early one morning, the sun barely cresting the horizon, and stepped outside into the crisp air. He didn't feel the cold like the others. His cabin had kept him warm, and the months of isolation had taught him to live in harmony with the land. As he walked, his boots crunching through the fresh snow, he felt the weight of the season, its toll on his neighbors, the losses they had suffered, and the lessons they had learned the hard way. It wasn't just the firewood that kept him warm. It was the cabin he had built slowly, deliberately, and the foresight he had shown in those first days. The gap, the small imperfection everyone had mocked, had saved lives. The fire had burned steady, keeping them alive when they thought they might not make it. That gap wasn't a flaw, it was a design. When Charlie returned to the cabin, he found the others still gathered around the fire. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered. Margaret and the children were resting, their faces finally free from the pallor of cold. Tom was sitting by the fire, his eyes heavy with sleep. Jack Carter, who had once mocked Charlie most fiercely, was now helping to stoke the fire, his hands steady and assured. "You're a hard man to catch up with," Jack said quietly, looking over at Charlie as he sat beside him. His voice was different now, respectful, even admiring. It was a tone Charlie had never expected from Jack. "I've seen a lot of winters, but this one was something else." Charlie nodded, watching the flames flicker in the hearth. "This one tested us all," he said, his voice soft but firm. "We built too fast. We thought we could outsmart the land, but it was the land that taught us." Jack glanced around at the others, those who had stayed, those who had found shelter in Charlie's cabin. "I've been thinking about that," he said, his voice lower now. "About how we all just rushed in, wanted to stake our claim, build our homes. Didn't think about what came after, didn't think about the cold, the wind, the snow." Charlie said nothing. The others, too, were silent, reflecting on what they had learned. They had come seeking refuge, and in turn they had found wisdom. It wasn't just about building cabins, it was about building for survival. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the warmth of the day began to melt the snow. Charlie felt the first stirrings of spring in the air, though it was still too early to trust it. But the land had survived the storm, and so had they. It wasn't the end of the winter, it was the beginning of something else. A new understanding, a new respect for the land they had come to call home. The first signs of spring appeared cautiously, like a secret only the land knew. The snow that had buried the plains for months began to melt, leaving behind a soft, muddy earth. The air felt different now, warmer, but still with a sharp edge to it. The winds had calmed, and with them the harshness of winter seemed to retreat, though no one was foolish enough to believe it was truly gone. The land had a way of revealing itself slowly, giving just enough warmth to coax out the first signs of life before the chill returned. Charlie had seen winters before. He had lived through them, learned from them. But this one had been different, more brutal, more testing. The toll it had taken on the others weighed heavy on his mind. Tom's family had made it through, but just barely. Jack's cabin, though reinforced with the knowledge Charlie had shared, had been damaged by the storm, and there were signs that it would take more than just a quick patch-up to make it whole again. Charlie had offered help, but he knew that some lessons could not be taught in one winter. Survival wasn't just about building a strong cabin or tending a fire. It was about understanding the land, the seasons, the winds. It was about knowing that what worked today might not work tomorrow. It was about preparing for what couldn't be predicted. But not all had made it. Some of the ranchers who had built hastily, who had rushed to stake their claims without thinking about the consequences, were gone. Their cabins, now abandoned, stood as hollow reminders of their failure. The land had taken what it had been, owed, and it had given nothing back. Charlie knew this was the price of wisdom, the price of being prepared. It wasn't just the sweat of building or the hours spent chopping firewood. It was the isolation, the solitude that came with thinking ahead, with looking beyond the horizon and seeing what others couldn't. It was knowing that your neighbors might call you foolish, that they might mock you for being too slow, for being too cautious, and in the end, when the storm passed, they'd see what you had built. They'd see the cabin that stood strong against the wind and the snow, and they would understand. Charlie's cabin was the last to be abandoned, the last to lose its warmth to the melting snow and the rising spring sun. But it was also the last to stand, and in its stead, it left a legacy of careful thought, of building for survival. It was a lesson learned, but it had come at a cost. As Charlie sat by the fire in his cabin, his mind turned to the future. There would be more winters. There would be more storms. And the land would test them all again. But Charlie knew this much: he had learned the price of wisdom. He had paid it, and now it was his to pass on. It was the last winter Charlie Reynolds would ever face alone in his cabin. By then, the town had grown, spreading slowly over the plains, but not fast enough to escape the tests of the land. The ranchers, once isolated in their homes, now formed a small community, bound together by the hard lessons of the past. Many had come to respect Charlie, though some never quite shed their skepticism. Still, the story of his cabin, with its foolish gap, lived on, told by those who had survived the harsh winter of 1993. The snow returned in late November, but this time it came as a reminder, a whisper of things gone by. Charlie had seen the signs early, heard the wind change its tone, watched the dark clouds roll in over the horizon. The storm would be strong, but nothing like before. The ranchers were ready this time. The cabins they had built, though not perfect, were sturdy enough to weather the snow. They knew how to handle the cold now, how to keep the fire steady and the warmth flowing through the cabin. They had learned, and they had remembered. But still, when the first heavy snowflakes began to fall, Charlie could feel a twinge of old fear. It wasn't the snow or the cold. It was the knowledge that no matter how prepared you were, the land had a way of reminding you that it was still in charge. The gap, which had once been a mockery, now felt like a part of him, something he had built for a reason. The fire burned bright, and the walls, thickened with time, stood firm. But there was always that feeling in the back of his mind, that slight edge of doubt. The first to arrive that winter was Tom Burke, his face weary and drawn from the last of the year's chores. He stepped into Charlie's cabin without knocking, as had become their custom. The wind howled outside, but the warmth inside was undeniable. "You feeling it too?" Tom asked, settling near the fire. Charlie nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I've been watching the sky." Tom followed his gaze but said nothing. He knew Charlie's quiet way of knowing things that others couldn't see. "Last year, we thought we were ready," Tom said after a pause. "But this year feels different. Feels like we might finally understand how to build for what's coming." Charlie smiled faintly, his face weathered from years of hard living. "Maybe, but you never know. The land's always got a surprise in store." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire filling the space between them. The storm outside intensified, the wind picking up and the snow piling high against the windows. It was a storm they had seen before, but with the knowledge of the past, they faced it with less fear. "Looks like the gap's still working," Tom said after a while, glancing at the walls. Charlie chuckled. "Guess I wasn't as foolish as they thought." The warmth inside the cabin didn't just come from the fire. It came from the quiet strength they had all learned to build together through years of survival and the lessons that the land had taught them. By the time the snow began to melt in early April, the land had already begun to change. Spring, as unpredictable as the winters, had its own way of announcing itself. The soft winds carried the scent of thawing earth, and for the first time in months, the sun felt warm against the skin. Charlie Reynolds stood at the edge of his cabin, watching the last of the winter's hold slip away. The world was quieter now, as if the land was catching its breath. His cabin, still standing strong, had become more than just a place to weather the storm. It was a monument to survival, to patience, to lessons learned the hard way. The gap in the wall, once laughed at and scorned, had proven itself to be the very thing that kept him warm, kept him alive. Over the years, it had become a symbol, a reminder of the cost of wisdom and the price of building for the worst. Charlie hadn't built his cabin for fame or for recognition. He hadn't done it to prove a point. He had built it because he knew deep down that the land could be unforgiving, and he had been right. In the early months of 1993, when the winter came crashing down with a fury no one had anticipated, his cabin stood firm. He had built it slowly, carefully, with his future in mind. And while the others rushed to finish their cabins, thinking they could simply endure the elements, Charlie had done the one thing no one else had. He had built for what could go wrong. And now here they were, in the soft light of spring, the storm behind them, the lessons behind them. The ranchers who had once mocked him now looked to him for guidance. They had rebuilt using Charlie's techniques. They had learned the value of patience and preparation. They knew what it meant to build for survival, not for speed. The gap, once a foolish mistake, had become a lesson for them all. Charlie turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the first signs of green were beginning to push through the snow. The landscape was changing, and so was the community that had sprung up around him. The days of isolation were over. The ranchers had come together, stronger now than before, with a shared understanding of what it meant to live on the frontier. He didn't need to say anything. The silence between him and the others was enough. They knew what he had given them, what he had taught them, without ever speaking it aloud. His work had become the foundation of something larger than just a cabin. It had become a way of life. Charlie took one last look at his cabin, the walls standing tall against the coming spring, and felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. He had built it for the worst, and in doing so, he had built a future for them all.